Welcome back to the deep dive. This is the knowledge shortcut that cuts through all the noise and gets right to the heart of things.
And today, we're doing something, well, something pretty profound. We're looking at the origin story of ethics in war.
And here's the hook that got us started on this whole thing. We aren't beginning in the 20th century. We're not even starting with The Hague.
No, we're going back much, much further. Our sources point to the world's first codified framework for war ethics being established over 1,000 years before any of that.
That's the insight right there. The one that just reframes this entire conversation. We all tend to assume that humanitarian law, this idea that you can fight a war but you can't be unjust while doing it, is a modern invention.
All right, born out of the horrors of World War I, World War II.
Exactly. But what we found in the source material is a legal and a moral tradition that is so much older. It dates all the way back to the 7th century.
And that forces you to just completely reconsider the timeline of civilization and conflict. It shows that this moral impulse, the one to limit violence and protect the vulnerable, it's not just a Western legal evolution. It has this deep, independent heritage.
So our mission today is a really rigorous comparison. We're going to take what the sources say is the world's first comprehensive moral framework for war, which was established in 7th century Islam, and we are placing it right alongside the modern architecture of global justice.
Which includes, the Geneva Conventions, but also the enforcement side of things.
The war crime jurisprudence of courts like the ICJ and the ICTY.
For anyone listening who really wants that shortcut to understanding, this is it. By tracing this evolution from these foundational moral rules all the way to global legal enforcement, you get a complete layered picture of why these rules matter and how they work today.
It's a study in moral persistence. Just think about the massive historical and technological divides we're talking about here. And as we start, if we had to boil it all down, if we had to find that single, unshakable moral truth that connects every single era we're about to look at, from a 7th century battlefield to a courtroom in The Hague, what is it?
It's a simple but incredibly powerful principle. War does not permit injustice.
Wow.
That one sentence. That's the thesis. It's the reason for every law, every treaty, and every single prosecution we're going to talk about today.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. To really understand how revolutionary the 7th century framework was, we have to set the stage. We have to know what the baseline was. What did war even look like before this?
The sources are pretty clear. The words they use are things like brutality and utterly unrestricted.
And that almost feels like an understatement when you dig into the detail.
It really is. Pre-Islamic warfare in that region and in many others was total war. The goal wasn't just to defeat an army. It was to annihilate the enemy society's ability to even exist or recover.
There is no such thing as a neutral person or a protected place.
None. No concept of it. If you were associated with the enemy, you were a target. It didn't matter if you were a farmer, a woman, a child. Everything was on the table.
Let's get specific, because the common practices are what the new code directly prohibits. So armies would routinely kill any civilian they came across.
No distinction.
It was standard practice to destroy all the crops, burn entire villages to the ground.
And poison the wells.
No.
Poisoning water sources was a key tactic.
A scorched earth policy, basically.
Absolutely. And it was purely tactical. It was designed to starve out the local population, to make sure that even if a few people survived, they couldn't sustain themselves afterward. There would be nothing left for them.
And it didn't stop with humans or infrastructure. They slaughtered animals indiscriminately.
Denying future food, future transport. And then there was maybe the darkest practice, which was the widespread mutilation of the bodies of the dead.
Which is a psychological tactic.
It's pure psychological warfare. It's designed to instill the absolute maximum amount of terror and disrespect in the enemy population.
And we need to be clear here. These weren't seen as war crimes. This wasn't a soldier going rogue. This was just the grammar of conflict. This was how war was waged.
It was the accepted playbook. So you have to imagine this environment. And then, into this environment, a new religious and legal framework is introduced that demands limitation, that demands protection. It was genuinely radical.
And our sources identify this 7th century framework as the world's first systematic, comprehensive moral, legal, and humanitarian code for war.
A crucial point here is that this wasn't just some philosopher's musings. These weren't suggestions.
No, these were explicit mandates. They were laid down by the Prophet Muhammad, and they immediately changed the entire rationale of warfare, from total destruction to a limited ethical conflict with very clear boundaries.
And because these commands were recorded in the foundational hadith collections, we're talking Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, they had immediate legal and theological weight. They were non-negotiable.
Okay, so let's run through the 6 core prohibitions. And as we do, you can just see how each one is a direct counterpunch to the brutality we just described.
The first one is the big one. It establishes non-combatant immunity. Do not kill women or children.
That's it, a direct, explicit line drawn in the sand. These people are military targets, and these people are protected.
Then, the second rule expands that circle of protection. Do not kill the elderly or the sick.
So it's not just about demographics like age or gender. It's about your physical condition. Vulnerability itself creates a protected status.
Precisely. Then you get into the economic and environmental rules, which, in the Arabian Peninsula, this was about survival. Rule 3 is, do not cut down trees or burn crops.
Okay, I want to pause on that one for a second, because to a modern military planner, don't cut down trees might seem almost trivial. But what does that specific instruction tell us about how sophisticated this code was?
It shows an immense strategic and moral foresight. It's not just about winning today's battle. It's about the long-term governance of the land you might conquer.
You're thinking about tomorrow.
You're thinking about tomorrow, next year, 10 years from now. When you prohibit the destruction of agriculture, especially fruit-bearing trees, which can take years and years to mature, you're protecting the enemy's future capacity to live.
You're protecting the society that will remain after the war is over.
Exactly. The law ensures that the war is waged against the fighting forces, not against the economic or ecological sustainability of the civilian population. It's a mandate for post-conflict recovery that's built right into the rules of engagement.
That completely reframes it. It's not just about being nice. It's about a sophisticated understanding of how societies survive.
And then you have this unprecedented rule on religious tolerance. Do not destroy places of worship.
Wow.
This immediately establishes the principle of protecting cultural and religious heritage, no matter what faith is being practiced inside those walls.
And finally, the rules about conduct and dignity. Do not kill animals except for food.
Which restricts the wanton slaughter of livestock.
And the last one, which might be the most powerful ethical statement of all. Do not mutilate the dead.
That one's huge. It guarantees that human dignity is maintained even for your defeated enemy. The respect for the human form doesn't end when life does.
So those 6 rules, they form the theoretical foundation. But the real revolution, and our sources really emphasize this, is that they were instantly operationalized. They weren't just ideals sitting in a book.
They were put into practice immediately.
Which brings us to this incredible case study, Caliph Abu Bakr's 10 rules. This happens right after the Prophet's death. The Muslim army is getting ready for a major campaign in Syria.
And this isn't legislation being debated. This is a military commander issuing the world's first formal, moral, operational order to his soldiers, before they even step foot on enemy territory.
This shows that compliance wasn't optional.
It was mandatory. This was the birth of a standing military code of conduct.
So let's look at these 10 marching orders, because they are a detailed expansion of those core prohibitions. Rules 1 and 2 set the standard for honor and restraint.
Right. Do not betray and do not be excessive.
And that last one, do not be excessive. That's the early, really succinct mandate for proportionality, which we're going to break down in a minute.
It's the whole concept in 4 words. Then he repeats the protection list.
Do not kill children, do not kill women, and do not kill the elderly.
That foundational principle of distinction is reinforced over and over. There's no room for doubt.
The agricultural rules get even more specific here. Rule 6 is do not cut fruit-bearing trees.
And Rule 7 is do not burn or drown palm trees.
Again, the focus on preserving the economic foundation of the land. Palm trees were the vital cash crop, the dietary staple of the region. This is incredibly specific.
It is. Then Rule 8 deals with livestock. Do not slaughter sheep or camels except for food.
Which links the ethical rule against needless destruction directly to the concept of military necessity.
Right. If you need it to eat, you can take it. If you don't, you leave it alone. Simple as that.
And the final 2 rules are about protecting civilization and sanctity. Do not ruin populated areas.
So safeguarding infrastructure, homes.
And then, critically, do not harm monks or worshippers in their monasteries.
And that specific rule It protects people who have dedicated themselves to contemplation, no matter what their religion is. It establishes an early form of neutrality for religious personnel and the places they live.
So when you add all up,
You've got it. Every single principle that forms the bedrock of modern international humanitarian law distinction, proportionality, necessity, environmental protection, property rights, sanctity, it's all articulated and enforced on the battlefield 1,400 years ago.
it's all there.
It's all there.
So now let's do the work of translation. We take those 7th century moral rules and we translate them directly into the, let's be honest, the dense legal language of modern international humanitarian law.
And this is so important for you to understand because it shows how that historical morality is the scaffolding that holds up today's really complex legal framework.
Okay, let's unpack this thoroughly. Let's go beyond just the simple definitions. Start with the big one, the most fundamental concept, distinction. How did do not kill women or children establish this pillar of modern law?
Well, the rule established distinction by creating a protected status based on identity. Distinction is the absolute cornerstone of IHL. It mandates that parties to a conflict must at all times distinguish between combatants and non-combatants.
And also between military objectives and civilian objects.
Exactly. Before this rule, the logic was simple. If you were part of the enemy tribe or state, you were a legitimate target. This rule, by explicitly protecting the most vulnerable, created a universal, objective legal barrier. And it was a barrier that couldn't just be crossed because of military expediency.
That seems straightforward enough, but in modern war, those lines can get really blurry. Especially with non-state actors, things get complicated. Did the early code have any way to grapple with, say, a woman who might be aiding the fight, but indirectly?
That's a great question. And that nuance would eventually be handled through the legal concept of direct participation in hostilities, which took centuries to evolve. But the starting point was protection. The default was immunity.
So the burden of proof was on the soldier.
The burden of proof, even back in the 7th century, fell on the soldier. You assume this person is protected unless there is clear, unambiguous evidence of combatancy. That initial bright-line protection for women, children, the sick was revolutionary because it guaranteed immunity unless they actively picked up a sword. It shifts the entire ethical burden onto the soldier and demands restraint first.
Okay, let's move to the idea of controlled force. Abu Bakr put it so simply, do not be excessive. And that has evolved into these really sophisticated modern legal concepts of proportionality and military necessity.
Precisely. They're two sides of the same coin. Military necessity is the justification for using force at all. The action must be necessary to achieve a legitimate military goal.
But proportionality is the break. It's the constraint.
It's the constraint. It dictates that even if a target is militarily necessary, the expected incidental harm, what we call collateral damage to civilians and civilian objects, must not be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage you expect to gain.
And this is where it gets really tricky in modern law, right?
Yeah.
How do you even begin to quantify excessive harm versus military advantage? Can you give us a concrete example to illustrate how that tension works?
Sure. Let's imagine a high-value military target. Say, an enemy command and control center is located on the ground floor of a large, densely populated apartment building.
Okay.
Military necessity says that destroying that command center is essential to winning the conflict. But proportionality forces you to do a calculation. Is the military advantage of taking out that one command center worth the inevitable death of, say, 150 non-combatant civilians who live in the apartments above it?
And there's no easy answer to that.
There's no easy answer. But the early instruction, do not be excessive, is the succinct 7th century way of forcing that exact moral calculation onto the commander. It ensures that the scope of violence is strictly controlled.
So in essence, proportionality ensures that military utility never gets to just completely override a foundational minimum of human dignity, no matter what the tactical gain might be.
That is the core moral premise. If the incidental harm is clearly excessive compared to the military gain, the action is unlawful, period.
Let's move on to those protections for the landscape, which were so unique. The rules against cutting trees, burning crops, ruining populated areas. Our sources connect this to environmental and property protection.
And this is maybe the most surprisingly modern aspect of the early code. I mean, for most of history, right up until the 20th century, environmental destruction was seen as a legitimate and highly effective tactic.
Siege warfare. Starve them out.
Exactly. But these rules establish that the environment and the civilian means of survival are not legitimate targets. And this isn't just about protecting someone's private property, it's about protecting ecological integrity and the regional economy for generations to come.
If you look at modern IHL, especially Additional Protocol from 1977, environmental protections are finally formalized, but they're often still debated. How much of that original 7th century principle really survived that massive time gap?
A surprising amount of it. The modern rules ban widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. Now, the 7th century code was focused on immediate civilian survival fruit trees, crops, palms. But the moral thread is identical. The war must be localized to the fighting forces and cannot be allowed to indefinitely compromise the health and recovery of the land itself.
It was an early form of sustainable conflict management.
You could absolutely call it that. And finally, you have the protection of monks, worshippers, and the ban on mutilation. This covers the spiritual realm and human dignity itself. And these directly establish the protection of religious sites and dignity. Protecting religious personnel enshrines the sanctity of worship and their neutrality. Banning mutilation, which was rampant, is a direct defense of dignity even after death.
So it establishes that respect for the human form, the idea that all life, even the life of an enemy you've defeated, deserves dignity, is paramount.
Yes, and that becomes the basis for the humane treatment of the dead, which is a major component of the Geneva Conventions.
So just to recap this section, we've shown that every core principle of modern IHL distinction, proportionality, military necessity, environmental protection, and dignity, was articulated and put into practice over a millennium before the modern world codified them.
The framework was truly established then. It's a powerful realization, really. The moral compass was calibrated correctly very, very early on. That 1,300-year gap between the 7th century code and the Geneva Conventions, it's less about the discovery of these morals and more about the world's slow and often very violent journey toward achieving global consensus and, crucially, enforcement.
And that enforcement piece is the perfect transition. We now have to jump forward those 1,300 years. We move from a regional religious legal code to a global secular treaty system.
The modern echo.
The modern echo. And the catalyst for modern IHL was completely different from the 7th century. That early code was a proactive moral assertion, part of a new social vision.
It was aspirational.
Modern IHL was a reactive necessity. It was a desperate response to brutality on an industrial scale. We're talking about the unprecedented suffering of World War II, the industrialization of genocide and the Holocaust, and just the complete collapse of morality on the battlefield.
That's it exactly. The sheer scale of civilian casualties, the Holocaust. It forced the global community to finally admit that the existing rules were either totally inadequate or just being ignored. It was a complete system failure.
The world realized that the rules of war had to be universally binding, non-negotiable.
Which led directly to the 1949 Geneva Conventions and their subsequent additional protocols.
And these conventions, they established the definitive legal framework for treatment in war. They codified principles that every single nation that signs them has to adhere to. Our sources highlight these key requirements that became the global promise to maintain humanity in conflict.
Let's run through them.
Okay. First, the fundamental protection of civilians, which includes making sure they have access to relief and aid. Second, humane treatment for prisoners of war, or POWs, mandating specific standards for housing, food, and medicine.
The absolute non-derogable prohibition of torture and cruel treatment. You can never justify it.
Protection for medical workers and personnel. Restriction on unnecessary destruction, which reinforces proportionality. And specific, special protections for vulnerable groups like women and children.
And it's the sheer scope of these requirements that makes them so powerful. They don't just ban bad actions. They mandate positive ones, like providing medical care. But the real insight for our deep dive here is how perfectly the legal scaffolding of the 20th century formalizes the moral scaffolding of the 7th.
Okay, this is the core of the comparison. Let's do it. A direct, rule-by-rule parallel. This is where we see the durability of these moral truths across millennia.
Let's start with distinction. The 7th century rule: no killing non-combatants.
Simple, direct.
That translates directly into the vast, detailed legal framework of civilian protection, which is codified in Geneva Convention the 4th. GCIC has specific regulations on everything from hospitals to relief operations to the rights of people in occupied territories. It's the detailed global expression of that ancient protective principle.
And the sanctity of religious figures. No killing monks or religious leaders.
That finds its direct parallel in the protection of religious personnel, chaplains, priests, imams, who are all considered non-combatants under Geneva law.
the special protection for women and children established so early on?
Now, a core element of Geneva, recognized in special protection categories that acknowledge their heightened vulnerability to specific war crimes, like sexual violence.
Okay, let's talk about captured soldiers. The early mandate was just for the humane treatment of captives.
And that simple idea became the robust, legally binding structure of Geneva Convention III, POW protections. It defines everything, from the limits on questioning techniques to the required sanitary conditions in camps. It ensures that the moment a soldier surrenders, their status changes. They are no longer an enemy combatant. They are a protected person under the law.
On the conduct front, the clear no torture rule from the 7th century.
That is reflected in Geneva's complete torture prohibition. And this is one of the very few rules of IHL that is considered jus cogens.
Okay, can you break down what jus cogens means?
It's a peremptory norm of international law. It means it's a fundamental principle that is accepted by the international community of states as a norm from which no deviation is ever permitted. Not for national security, not for anything. It's an absolute.
Got it. And the respect for the physical body. No mutilation of bodies.
That translates directly to the classification of war crimes for desecration today. Desecrating the dead isn't just an insult. It's an attack on dignity and is often seen as a precursor to broader crimes against humanity.
And finally, that forward-thinking environmental rule, no destruction of crops or trees.
That was expanded into the modern legal environment through the Additional Protocol 1 in 1977, which specifically bans methods of warfare that are intended, or maybe expected, to cause severe long-term damage to the natural environment.
So the moral duty to protect the land for future generations finally became a global legal requirement.
It did.
It is genuinely astounding when you lay it out like that. That principles written as operational orders for a small army in the 7th century map so precisely onto a global treaty hammered out by dozens of nations in the 20th. What does that historical echo tell us about the nature of morality in war?
It suggests that the definition of humanity in conflict is far more fixed than the technology of conflict. The technological capacity for destruction changed. I mean, fundamentally, from swords and arrows to autonomous drones and thermobaric bombs. But the moral line, the line separating a combatant from a non-combatant, necessity from excess, dignity from depravity, that line remained exactly where those early rules placed it.
So Geneva wasn't an invention, it was a formalization.
It was the necessary formalization of a moral truth that was established long, long ago.
But codified law, like the Geneva Conventions, that's just the rule book. And a rule book without a referee is, well, it's just a book.
Right. True justice requires accountability.
Which brings us to the modern era of global enforcement. The courts and tribunals that are tasked with prosecuting individuals and holding states responsible when they break these rules. This is where we move from law on paper to justice in a courtroom.
And this transition is a monumental legal achievement. Before the late 20th century, the idea of holding an individual head of state or a top general accountable for mass atrocities was, well, it's extremely rare. The rise of these international criminal tribunals, it cemented the principle that violations of IHL are crimes against all of humanity and they are punishable by global justice.
So we have to talk about the two foundational tribunals that really proved this concept could work, the ICTY for the former Yugoslavia and the ICTR for Rwanda. Let's start with the ICTY.
The ICTY's mandate was groundbreaking. It was set up in 1993, and it was tasked with prosecuting serious violations of IHL committed during the Balkan Wars. And our sources detail the specific crimes that defined its legacy. We're talking about ethnic cleansing, mass rape as a tool of war, genocide, systemic torture, and widespread deliberate attacks on civilians.
What were the crucial legal precedents that the ICTY established, the things that changed how these rules are applied forever?
The ICTY really solidified several key legal concepts that are now just staples of IHL enforcement. First, it extensively applied the principle of command responsibility.
Which means the person at the top is responsible.
It holds high-ranking military and political leaders criminally responsible for the crimes their subordinates commit, but only if they knew or should have known about them and then failed to prevent or punish them. It punctures the shield of, I was just following orders and I didn't know.
And the second major precedent.
Second, it explicitly prosecuted systematic sexual violence, like mass rape, as a crime against humanity and, in some contexts, as an act of genocide. It confirmed legally that these atrocities are not just unfortunate side effects of war. They are planned, prosecutable, and profound violations of human dignity.
And then you have the ICTR, the Rwanda Tribunal, which dealt with the absolute horror of the 1994 genocide. It focused on the ultimate crime.
The ICTR was instrumental in defining genocide under the 1948 Genocide Convention. It handed down landmark judgments, including prosecuting the leaders who used radio broadcasts for incitement to genocide.
So it proved that words themselves can be weapons.
It proved that words used to fuel conflict can constitute crimes against humanity. It solidified the legal definition that genocide means acts committed with the specific intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Its work reinforced this global obligation to prevent mass atrocity that really began with that simple 7th century protection of life.
So those two tribunals confirmed individual criminal liability, but accountability also has to extend to the state level, which is where the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, comes in.
Right, the ICJ is different. It settles disputes between states. It applies international public law, often concerning a state's obligations related to war crimes and, crucially, genocide prevention.
So if the ICTY prosecutes
the ICJ holds the state accountable for meeting its treaty obligations. The legal principles here are a bit more subtle, but they're absolutely critical for understanding how modern global governance works.
Okay, let's dive into the specifics of these high-profile ICJ cases from the sources. We'll start with Bosnia and Herzegovina v. Serbia and Montenegro from 2007. This is often called the Srebrenica genocide case.
This was a landmark ruling on the Genocide Convention. The ICJ found that while Serbia hadn't directly committed genocide, it had violated its obligation to prevent genocide under Article 1 of the Convention.
And what's the legal principle that established?
It established the crucial distinction between the obligation of conduct and the obligation of result. States have an obligation of conduct, meaning they must actively take all measures within their power to try to prevent a genocide, even if they can't guarantee the result, which would be actually stopping it.
So a state can't just stand by and say, well, we didn't do it ourselves.
Exactly. This finding vastly expanded the scope of state responsibility. It means passive condemnation is not enough. A state has to show it took proactive measures to uphold the humanitarian rules of the international system.
That is a deep legal insight. Okay, next case. Congo v. Uganda in 2005. This one confirmed that responsibility isn't just moral, it can also be financial.
Yes. The ICJ found that Uganda, as an occupying power in parts of the DRC, had violated international law, killing civilians, destroying property, looting resources. And crucially, the court ordered Uganda to pay compensation, reparations, to the DRC for the damages caused.
So it established a precedent that these violations have a quantifiable financial cost.
It makes state noncompliance significantly more expensive than compliance. It puts a price tag on injustice.
Moving to more recent and very publicized cases, we have Gambia v. Myanmar about the Rohingya genocide.
This case really demonstrated the ICJ's ability to act quickly in a crisis. Gambia successfully petitioned the court to issue what are called provisional measures,
which are like urgent temporary orders.
Exactly. They're required to prevent irreparable harm while the full years-long case is adjudicated. The ICJ ordered Myanmar to take all measures within its power to prevent genocide, including ensuring its military and police don't commit genocidal acts. That power to issue immediate, legally binding emergency orders is the court's strongest tool for intervention.
And finally, the 2024 case, South Africa v. Israel, which also focuses on these obligations to prevent genocide.
This case is significant because, again, it confirmed the ICJ's jurisdiction over these disputes, and it also resulted in provisional measures requiring Israel to take steps to prevent genocidal acts and to ensure the provision of humanitarian aid. Now, regardless of the final outcome of that case, the very fact that sovereign states are using the ICJ to debate the application of genocide prevention, a principle rooted in the fundamental protection of life, it shows that this framework of accountability is robust. It's deeply entrenched in modern diplomacy.
So when you look across all of these judicial bodies, the ICTY prosecuting a general, the ICTR defining incitement, the ICJ ordering states to prevent genocide and pay for damages, it all seems to point back to that one single unifying moral truth we started with.
It does. The sophisticated legal apparatus of the 21st century, with all its complex definitions of intent, conduct, and liability, is entirely dedicated to enforcing that simple 7th century principle. War does not permit injustice. The law has evolved from a moral command into a global criminal mandate.
So for our final section, let's synthesize these three eras one last time. This high-level comparison really demonstrates the absolute persistence of these ethical demands, regardless of who is in power or what technology they're using.
We're tracking a single moral impulse as it travels across time, and we're confirming that the same ethical standard applies now as it did then, just with very different means of enforcement.
Okay, so let's walk through it. Take the concept of immunity.
The 7th century Islamic rules demanded civilian immunity. It was a moral injunction.
The Geneva Conventions then codified this into the detailed legal standard of civilian protection. That's a treaty obligation.
And today, the modern courts ensure that targeting civilians is prosecuted as a war crime. That's individual criminal liability.
It's a straight line. Let's do the next one. The absolute ban on inhumane treatment.
The Islamic rules mandated no torture. A moral command.
Geneva codified this as an absolute torture prohibition. A just cogens norm, as you explain.
And modern tribunals confirm that torture is a crime against humanity, which is one of the gravest possible international offenses.
Okay, what about cultural protection?
The early code mandated the protection of religious sites. Geneva expanded this to broader cultural property protections, recognizing them as vital to the heritage of all humankind.
And today?
And today, attacks on religious sites are prosecuted by modern courts. There's an acknowledgement of the deep cultural injury that's caused when you target a church, a mosque, or a synagogue.
Even the concept of restraint evolves so logically. The early rule, no harm to animals unless it's for food, was an early form of military necessity.
And that principle is now considered part of humanitarian ethics in modern IHL, indirectly protected by general welfare and proportionality rules, ensuring resources aren't just destroyed wantonly.
This whole comparative analysis, it leads us directly to the ratio decidendi. I love that legal term, the ultimate finding. The reason that justifies this entire 14th century legal structure.
And that foundational principle is just undeniable. Even in war, when emotions, fear, and power run wild, justice must remain the controlling force. Human dignity does not end on the battlefield.
That is the ultimate lesson here. It doesn't deny the chaos, the tragedy of conflict, but it insists that law must impose order on that chaos. It insists that military goals are always subordinate to the dignity of the human being, whether they're alive or dead, combatant or non-combatant.
Absolutely. The three-part legacy is crystal clear. The 7th century framework laid down the earliest comprehensive humanitarian rules. The Geneva Conventions codified those principles on a global scale. And modern war crime tribunals ensure accountability through individual and state enforcement.
And the collective truth.
The collective truth confirmed by all three eras is that to wage war without law is fundamentally to wage war without humanity.
Which brings us to our final reflection for you, the listener. The sources we looked at offer a really powerful closing statement. Civilization is not ultimately defined by how people live in peace, but by how they maintain morality and adherence to law during conflict. A just nation protects human dignity even when it's fighting its enemies.
And that idea that morality is really tested, it's proven in the crucible of war, that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to explore on your own.
Okay, what is it?
Given the sheer historical time gap, we're talking over 1,300 years between that comprehensive 7th century code and the 20th century formalization in Geneva. Why? Why did it take 2 catastrophic world wars and industrial-scale genocide for humanity to collectively agree to and enforce these high moral standards on a global level?
Why did the knowledge exist for so long before the consensus was finally achieved?
What is that massive delay, that reluctance to adopt these rules voluntarily? What does that say about the relative power of, innate ethical codes or religious mandates versus the pressure of formal, legally binding international law that's backed by enforcement?
Is law just a reactive tool forced on us by tragedy?
Or could humanity have found this justice sooner?
That is something truly worth mulling over. Thank you for taking this extraordinary deep dive with us today into the history and the enforcement of justice in conflict.
Until next time.
We'll see you in the next deep dive.